So currently we have a single test to test the authorization. So if the client doesn't provide a token, we expect a 401 error. However, if you look at the authorization middleware's implementation, you can see here we have multiple execution paths. So one possibility is that we don't have a token, and that's the path we have tested. But it's also possible that the client sends a token, but this is not a valid JSON Web Token. In that case, we need to test that the status of the response is 400. So you might be asking why we didn't write this test in our genre suite. The reason for this is because we use this authorization middleware in different parts of our application on different endpoints for creating a genre, for updating a genre, for deleting a genre, as well as other resources. It doesn't make sense to repeat all this logic every time you want to test an endpoint. So technically, we should test this authorization middleware separately to make sure all the execution paths work. And then for endpoints that require authorization, like in this case, for posting a genre, we just write one test to make sure that the authorization middleware is included before our route handler. So in this lecture, we're going to test the authorization middleware separately. So back in our project, in our integration tests folder, let's add a new file, auth.test.js. Now here we're mixing the testing of middleware and route handlers. We're putting all these test files under the integration folder. Now if you have a large application, you may want to separate these into different folders like middleware and routes, just like how we have organized our project. So in this test file, first we create a test suite for our authorization middleware. Now, let's write the first test. It should return 401 if no token is provided. Now in this lecture, we're going to use Masha's technique for writing clean tests. So first I define the happy path. Let's call that execute. Here we're going to send a request. So first we need to import super test. So we get the request function. We also need our server. So to save time, I'm going to back to our genres test file. On the top, earlier we wrote these before each and after each functions to start and shut down the server. So let's copy these, put them here. Now in after each, we don't need to remove the genre, so let's clean this up and put everything on a single line. All right, so now we need to send a request to an endpoint that requires authorization. For example, our genres endpoint, but we could pick any other endpoints. So request to the server, it should be a post request. Here's the endpoint /API/genres. And let's make sure to put a valid object here. So when we check the status of the response, we know that we sent a valid object, but the errors that we're getting are coming from our authorization middleware. So we set the name to a valid genre. That's it. And then finally, we return the response. Now in the last lecture, we awaited this and then defined this as async, but this is really unnecessary. We would have to do this if we didn't want to return immediately, and then we wanted to do some extra work and then eventually return some value. But in this case, we can simply return this promise that we get from this expression. We don't need async here. And then we can await this promise here when we call the execute function. So await, execute. Now I forgot to set the token here in our request. So let's add that as well. We call the set method. The key is x auth token, and the value is token. Now in before each, we set token to a valid JSON Web Token. So first, let's define token here, and then we add before each In this function, we set token. Now here we need the user model. So on the top, let's require it. We go 2 levels up, models folder, user module, and then use object destructuring to get this type. Okay, now back to our before each function. We new up a user and then call generate auth token. So all the plumbing is done. Now back to our test. We want to test the scenario where we don't have a token. So we set this to an empty string. We execute, get the response, and then assert that response.status to be 401. Save, back in the terminal. We have a failing test because we used await and I forgot to include async here. One more time. All tests are passing. Beautiful. Now, what if we set token to null? What do you think is going to happen? Let's see. Save. Back in the terminal, our test failed. So we expected 401, but we got 400. The reason for this is that when we call the set method, whatever we pass here will be converted to a string. So when we pass null, that null will be sent as a string in an actual HTTP request. So back to our authorization middleware, token will no longer be falsy, will end up in this try block. We'll verify that token. Obviously, it's invalid. So that's why we end up in the catch block and get a 400 error. So back to our test file. To test that there is no token, we shouldn't set this to null. We should use an empty string. Now the second test case. So I'm going to duplicate this. This time, we want to send an invalid token. So as you saw in the implementation, if we have an invalid token, we should expect a 400 error. So should return 400 if token is invalid. So we set this to a simple string like A and assert that we get a 400 error. Back in the terminal, all tests are passing, beautiful. Now another test. So duplicate this. This time we're going to focus on our happy path. So if we send a valid token, we expect a response with the status of 200. So it should return 200 if token is valid. So we don't need to reset this here. And then expect that status to be 200. Back in the terminal, one of our tests failed, but this is a different test, not the one we're currently working on. So this is coming from our genres endpoint, the test we wrote earlier. When getting all the genres, we expected to get 2, but we ended up getting 3. The reason for this is because in this new test file for testing the authorization middleware, in the happy path, we're creating a new genre, but we forgot to do cleanup after. So the proper way to write this test is that here in the after each function, we should clean up. So that was a mistake on my part. We await genre.remove all objects. And of course, we need to import genre on the top. So let's duplicate this line and change user to genre. Very simple. Now back in the terminal, all tests are passing. Now one last thing. Here in our Auth middleware, if the client provides a valid JSON Web Token, we want to make sure that this request.user property is populated with the payload of that JSON Web Token. So we need to properly test this. However, as far as I know, with this super test library, we don't have access to the request object. We can only work with the response. So to test this, we need to write a unit test. And that's what I'm going to show you in the next lecture.